All right, I'm almost a little hesitant to ask a question now, so uh, one thing I was wondering about was a lot of people I think would argue that kind of the values of Western civilization, free speech, the right of the individual, separation between church and state, have developed through not so much in continuous with the Judeo-Christian morality, but almost in their overthrow through such things as the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and how these values would never have come out of just simply the continuous of the Middle Ages and that Judeo-Christian morality. But my understanding of your view would be that those values are inherent in the Judeo-Christian morality. And I'm just wondering how you think, just what is the value of Judeo-Christian morality in the modern world?
Yeah, it's a great question. They're not rational values. They're deeper than rational values. I mean, it was a surprise to me, going back into the past, let's say, to see how deep these values were. But I would say that not only are they part of the Judeo-Christian story, let's say, but that they're grounded in phenomena that are even deeper than that. Now, there's been a fair bit of investigation into the emergence of fair play, let's say, among animals, rats, primates, wolves, and so forth. There's an ethos that emerges behaviorally and is then perhaps woven into narrative and then codified that seems to be isomorphic across these different levels. And I think it's been well articulated in the narrative sense in the Judeo-Christian corpus of stories, and that it's out of that that our legal systems and institutions of rights have emerged. People make the case that that was fundamentally an Enlightenment issue, and it was certainly the case that the rational clarity that came along with the Enlightenment increased the degree to which that was articulated and transformed into law, but I think to attribute it to that is a great mistake. I think the time span view is way too narrow. That's 500 years ago. I'm a biologically minded guy. It's like 500 years, that's nothing. 5,000 years, well, that's starting to register. 50,000 years, it's worthy of note. 6 million years, now you're getting somewhere. There's the ethic that we're discussing is way deeper than something conjured up in like 1500 by some northern Italians. So it's an articulation of a substructure that's much deeper than the articulation itself. That's what it looks like to me. Now, I think there's room for intelligent debate about that. But I've looked at the Enlightenment thinkers and at the deeper, at people who I regard as deeper. And I think the deeper guys, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Jung in particular, Solzhenitsyn to some degree, they've got it right. So I don't think that our rights are an Enlightenment project. Their instantiation into codified law, that's more part and parcel of the Enlightenment. That would be particularly manifest in a place like the United States, so.
Yeah, if I can just ask kind of a related question. You mentioned Nietzsche, and because from what I understand of your work, you seem to draw from him a lot, and again, you said you agree with him. So I guess... he thinks a lot of things. Yeah, so I guess I'm wondering where you think, because I imagine he went wrong in his interpretation of the Christian morality and how he believes that's kind of a pernicious slave-based morality. So what exactly do you think? Because you agree with a lot of other things. Well, he didn't really critique Christian morality. He critiqued Christian dogma and structures. That's not exactly the same thing. So you would agree with him then? Well, like I said, he's a complicated guy, but I think the slave morality idea, the idea that the oppressed are somehow virtuous, which I don't think is a central Christian idea, by the way. It was something that he criticized as part and parcel of what was constructed and concretized in institutional Christianity. And Nietzsche also, and this is a deeper critique, I think, Nietzsche really criticized institutional Christianity, particularly the Protestant and Catholic forms, I would say,
for insufficient attention paid to the imitation of Christ and too much attention paid to the idea that the work of redemption had already been done, which is something that also divides the Orthodox Christian types from the Protestants and the Catholics, because the Orthodox types tend to tilt more towards the moral demand that you imitate Christ in your own life. And so Nietzsche's a very, you can't sum him up very easily, and I found him extraordinarily useful in training me how to think. To say that you agree with him, I don't think that you can say with someone like Nietzsche that you agree with him, because Nietzsche had, this is one thing that Nietzsche said that I really got a kick out of, because it's the most arrogant statement I've ever heard anyone make. He said, I can write in a sentence what it takes other people a book to relate. And then he said, no, what other people can't even relate in a book. And that's exactly right. Like if you read Beyond Good and Evil, for example, which is mostly aphorisms, so because he was a very sick man and he couldn't write for long periods of time, so he would think for long periods of time and then write down a little bomb. And Beyond Good and Evil is just sequential pieces of dynamite. And he wasn't trying to be systematic precisely. And so that's why it's not so easy to agree or disagree with Nietzsche, but you can sure let the bombs go off in your brain if you read what he has to say. And he was an interesting critic of Christianity, because, if you're all warped and bent and someone comes along and tells you how you're warped and bent in a manner that might enable you to straighten up, it's not obvious that you're their enemy, that they're your enemy. And I think that's the right way to read Nietzsche with regards to Christianity. So there was plenty of rot, and that was part of what was causing, let's say, the death of God. Now, it isn't obvious at all that Nietzsche was antithetically opposed to the founding ideas. In fact, there's many places where he writes that indicate quite the contrary. So.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to go to Alex, and then Saeed is going to distribute the microphones.
Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. So I was watching a few of your interviews in preparation for this, and I heard you speak about religion quite a bit. And if you look up what religion means in the Webster Dictionary, you get something like a system of faith centered on a supernatural being or beings or something like that. Mm-hmm. But I've heard you use religion to describe things like punk rockers, for example, that's a religious experience. So my first question would be, how do you define what is considered religious? And then sort of as a follow-up to that, if, say, Sam Harris...
Religious is what you act out.
What's that?
Religious is what you act out.
Anything you act out.
Everything you act out is predicated on your implicit axioms. And the system of implicit axioms that you hold as primary is your religious belief system. It doesn't matter whether you're an atheist or not. That's just surface noise.
So it has nothing to do with divinity or supernatural beings?
No.
Or it doesn't necessarily have to do with those?
No, it probably necessarily has to do with it too, but it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your voluntarily articulated statements about whether or not you believe in something like a transcendent deity. So, I mean, what you act out is much more what you are than what you say about yourself. And what the hell do you know about what you believe anyways? You're complicated, man.
It's a fair question.
Well, seriously, people are complicated. Like we're not transparent to ourselves at all. That's why we have to go to university and study psychology. It's like, we're not exactly black boxes, but we are the most complicated things there are, right? And we can't even program our VCR clocks. So it's like, how the hell can we propose to understand ourselves? And, I'm existentially oriented, which is to say that I think that what you hold to be true is best determined as a consequence of an analysis of your actions rather than as a consequence of an analysis of what you purport to believe. Now, in order to act you can't act without a hierarchy of value, which I tortured the other poor questioner about. You can't act without a hierarchy of values, because you can't act unless you think one thing is better than another. Because why would you act otherwise? So that means that you're embedded within a hierarchy of values, whether you know it or not, or maybe multiple fragmentary and competing hierarchies of value, which is all the worse for you, by the way, because it just makes you very confused. That hierarchy of values has an axiomatic, it's based on axioms, and the probability that you understand them is very low, because generally people don't understand their axioms. But that axiomatic system is essentially your religious system. And there's no way out of that, as far as I can tell. And you can say, well, it isn't predicated on conscious belief in a transcendent deity. It's like, okay, have it your way. But, you know, most people in this room act out a Judeo-Christian ethic. And not only do they act it out, if they're treated in a manner that's not commensurate with that ethic, they get very, very, very annoyed. So for example, if I fail to treat you as if you're an embodiment of a divine fragment, let's say, that's characterized by the ability to make free choice and to determine your own destiny in some sense, or if I fail to treat you as if you're a valued contributing member of the polity as a sovereign individual, then you'll find that very offensive and become angry. It's like, okay, then that's what you believe. Well, if I ask you if you believe any of that, well, that's a whole different story. You might give me some radical leftist nonsense. But that doesn't take away from what you've that doesn't take away from the fundamentals of your action.
As one final thing, so when you and, say, Sam Harris argue about religion, you're arguing about fundamentally different things, it sounds like. His conception of what is religious is very different from yours.
Yeah, well, he tends to think of religious thought the same way that a smart 13-year-old atheist thinks about a fundamentalist Christian. It's like, yeah, okay, you're just not getting to the heart of the matter. You know, and I just finished reading all of Sam's books in the last couple of weeks, and as far as I'm concerned, he doesn't ever get to the bottom of the issue. He doesn't address the fundamental thinkers. There are some profound thinkers. Dostoevsky's one, Tolstoy, Nietzsche, Jung. It's like they're completely absent from, and the same with Dawkins. It's completely absent. All that conceptualization is completely absent from their corpus of works. They don't even have an understanding for the psychological utility of religion. And it's a big problem. You know, you don't get to be an atheist when the people you attack are like naive fundamentalists. And I have some sympathy for the naive fundamentalists. It's like what they're basically saying is something like this. Look, we have an ethos that's valuable. You scientist types are casually dismantling it. What the hell are we supposed to do? Well, the fundamentalists don't know what to do about that, so they say, well, creationism is science. It's like, well, no, it's not. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a point. Their point is there's something valuable here. It's like, don't break it casually. What are you going to replace it with? The new atheists wish that everybody becomes rational. It's like, yeah, sure, that's going to happen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson. I'm a student of religious studies, and currently I'm writing an honors thesis on religious imagery in an Indo-Persian literary genre. There's a poet-philosopher who said the following, which I think you'll like, who, by the way, was a huge fan of Goethe. He said that in addressing God, he calls him the hidden reality, and he asks the hidden reality to reveal itself, but using the robe of metaphor, because he thinks that metaphor is the only way, stories are the only way that human beings can comprehend, you know, the hidden reality. I know you've written a lot, you speak a lot about religious stories. I just wanted to ask you, although it may be a very broad question, what is the place of the religious in stories? And
religious is something like the grammatical structure of stories. Like if you go down and you look at what makes a story, that's religious. Yeah, it's not a story otherwise. Like a story is a particular sort of thing. Like in its simplest sense, a story is an account of how to get from point A to point B. It's like a map. But there's a value structure inherent in that, obviously, because otherwise you wouldn't go from point A to point B. So just to make the map means to adopt a value structure. But the story is actually more complicated than that, because as you move from point A to point B, processes of radical transformation are often necessary. And the deep stories about the processes of radical transformation that occur as you move from point A to B are basically, they're indistinguishable from religious stories. Now, I think the reason they tend to become religious, let's say, is because it has something to do with the gap between the finite and comprehensible and the infinite and incomprehensible. It's like we live in the finite and comprehensible, but we're surrounded by the infinite and incomprehensible, and there has to be a border between those, of some, like a mediating border. That's poetry and art. That's narrative. That's religion. And it's that strange metaphorical reality, let's say, that's not factual, and it's not comprehensible, but that's not infinitely incomprehensible either. It's a bridge between the two. So, and as you move closer to the infinite and incomprehensible across that bridge, you get farther and farther away from what you understand, right? But how could it be otherwise, given that you're finite, you are a finite being, surrounded by what's infinite and incomprehensible.
And that was his critique of the strict rationalists, that they can't, that it's hard for them to make this, that's where poets come in, and that's where artists come in. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, and I learned a lot of this from Jung, because Jung's idea was that rationality is embedded in a dream. Like there's the infinite unknowable, and then there's the dream. And then inside the dream is the rational domain. And I believe that to be the case. Why else would we dream? We have to dream. If we don't dream, we go insane. It doesn't take very long. And so there's an element of poetic conceptualization that grounds us, and it has to be taken seriously. You know, the rational critics of dreams think about them as random neural activity. It's like there's nothing when you look at a TV screen that's not on a channel, that's random. When you dream something complex and sophisticated, that's not random. So, yeah, so the metaphor surrounds us, let's say. And we can critique it rationally and we can undermine it, but there's real danger in that. So